August 23rd, 1944. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Granville, France. The afternoon light cut through the window in sharp angles, illuminating dust particles that hung suspended in the air like tiny fragments of history waiting to settle. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his desk, a simple wooden structure that had witnessed countless decisions that would shape the world. Before him lay a field report typed on standard military stationery dated August 20th. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from weakness, from controlled fury. Eisenhower was 53 years old, though the weight of supreme command had aged him faster than time itself. His face carried the deep lines of a man who sent thousands to their deaths with the stroke of a pen, who balanced the egos of nations, who carried the hopes of the free world on shoulders that sometimes felt too narrow for the burden. He read the report again. Third time. The words hadn't changed. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. had written that his Third Army had sealed the Falaise Gap, had destroyed the German Seventh Army, had won the greatest victory of the Normandy campaign. Victory belonged to American troops under his command. The glory was his. Eisenhower set the paper down carefully, precisely, the way a man handles a loaded weapon. He looked out the window toward the Norman countryside. Somewhere beyond that horizon, 20 miles north, lay a battlefield he had visited just yesterday. A place the soldiers were already calling the Corridor of Death. He could still smell it. The August heat cooking flesh that had been men and horses 3 days ago, the sweet, sick odor that cloth masks couldn't filter, that would live in his nostrils for weeks. He had walked among the wreckage, seen what victory actually looked like when you stripped away the glory and the parades. That was the battlefield George Patton was claiming as his own. Eisenhower turned back to his desk, reached for another folder. This one contained intelligence reports. The real story. The truth that Patton was hoping he didn't know. Canadian and Polish forces had closed the gap from the north. They had fought for 10 brutal days straight. They had faced the toughest German divisions in France. They had paid for every mile with blood. The 1st Canadian Army, not Patton's Third Army, had finished the job. Eisenhower pressed his fingers to his temples. General George S. Patton, the most famous American commander in Europe, was trying to erase a Canadian victory from history. He wanted the glory for himself. Now Eisenhower had to decide what to do about it. The war in France was reaching its most important moment. 75 days had passed since D-Day, when Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6th. Those had been hard days. American, British and Canadian troops had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, losing thousands of men for every small village captured. The Germans had made them pay for every field and every road, but now everything was changing. The Allies had broken through the German lines. They had trapped the enemy in a pocket near the towns of Falaise and Argenton. Over 100,000 German soldiers were caught in a closing vice. 2 Allied armies were squeezing shut. Patton's Third Army pushed from the south. The 1st Canadian Army pushed from the north. Somewhere in between, those hands would meet and lock together. When they did, the German army in France would be destroyed. The question was simple. Which army would seal the pocket? Which nation would win the race? Whoever got there first would claim victory. Their country would get the glory. Their general would be famous. The history books would remember their name. The stakes were enormous. Between 50,000 and 100,000 German troops were trapped. More than 10,000 German vehicles sat in that pocket like fish in a barrel. If the Allies could close the gap completely, they might end the war months earlier. This was the largest battle of encirclement on the entire Western Front, but Eisenhower understood that more than military victory hung in the balance. National prestige was at stake. When the war ended, which countries would sit at the peace table with the most respect. Those questions would be answered partly by who won battles like Falaise. And beyond prestige, there was the historical record itself. Whoever controlled the story of this battle would control how millions of people remembered the war. Would Canadian sacrifice be honored, or would it be forgotten? Eisenhower pressed the button on his desk intercom. "Major, come in here, please." The door opened. A young staff officer entered, crisp and efficient. "Sir, I need you to understand something," Eisenhower said quietly. "What I'm about to tell you is not for the official record, not yet, but someone needs to know the truth." The Major's eyes widened slightly. "Sir? Sit down. Let me tell you what really happened at Falaise." Eisenhower stood and walked to the large map that dominated one wall of his office. France spread before him like a vast chessboard. He picked up a pointer. June 6th, D-Day. We stormed 5 beaches in Normandy, secured a foothold in France, but just barely. For the next 7 weeks, we fought through the Norman hedgerows. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Casualties were horrible. He traced movements with the pointer. Then on July 25th, the Americans launched Operation Cobra. We punched a hole through the German lines near Saint-Lô. Patton's Third Army poured through that gap like water through a broken dam. Suddenly the war changed. Eisenhower moved the pointer in a sweeping arc. The plan became clear. Instead of chasing the Germans back to Germany, we would trap them right here in France. 2 pincers would meet near the towns of Argentan and Falaise. When those pincers closed, Hitler's army in France would be destroyed. He tapped 2 points on the map. The responsibilities were divided carefully. Patton's Third Army would sweep around from the south. They would race east and then turn north. Their goal was to reach Argentan and then hold position. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which included the 1st Canadian Army, would attack south from Caen. The Canadians would drive toward Falaise and then continue south to link up with the Americans. Eisenhower set down the pointer and turned to face the Major directly. The boundary between the 2 forces was set on the map. Each army knew its job. He walked back to his desk, pulled out 4 photographs, laid them in a row. 4 generals shaped this battle. Their personalities mattered as much as their armies. First photograph, a man with sharp features and intense eyes. Lieutenant General Guy Simons commanded the 2nd Canadian Corps, 41 years old, the youngest corps commander in the British Commonwealth, brilliant tactician who designed Operation Tractable, the final push to close the gap from the north. His soldiers respect him, but they also fear him. He drives them hard because he knows what's at stake. Second photograph, an older man with a weathered face. General Harry Crerar commanded the entire 1st Canadian Army, 55 years old. For the first time in the war, Canadians had their own army-level command. Before this, Canadian troops had always fought under British or American generals. Crerar felt enormous pressure to prove that Canadians could lead at the highest level. The eyes of his nation were watching. Third photograph, a man with ivory-handled pistols and absolute confidence. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. commanded the United States Third Army, 59 years old. Already a legend, he believes in attacking fast and never stopping. Deeply competitive, he wants to win every race and claim every victory. He thinks British generals are too slow. He has made comments suggesting he does not think much of Canadian military ability either. To Patton, war is a competition, and he intends to finish first. Fourth photograph, Eisenhower picked it up, looked at it for a long moment. And then there's me. My job is harder than fighting Germans. I have to manage the egos of generals like Patton and Montgomery. I have to keep the British, Americans, and Canadians working together, even when they disagree. I am smart and patient, but I also have limits to my patience, and George Patton is testing those limits right now. The Major shifted in his chair. Sir, what exactly did General Patton do? Eisenhower sat down heavily. On August 13th, Patton's forces reached Argenton from the south. They had moved fast, just as Patton likes. The gap between his army and the Canadians was now only about 20 miles. Patton sent an urgent message to his superiors. He wanted permission to keep going north. He wanted to drive all the way to Falaise and close the gap himself. "What did you say, sir?" Montgomery said no. The boundary lines were set for a reason. If Patton's army pushed north while Canadians pushed south, there was real danger. They would start shooting at each other. The smoke and confusion of battle makes it hard to tell friend from enemy. Besides, the Canadians were already fighting toward Falaise. Eisenhower's jaw tightened. Patton was furious. He wrote in his diary that he was being held back to let the British take the glory. He believed his army could have closed the gap in one day if we had just let him go. Could he have, sir? No. His supply lines were stretched thin. His tanks were running low on fuel. German forces were still strong enough to counterattack. The decision to stop at Argenton was military common sense, not politics. But Patton saw it differently. Stopped at Argenton while Canadians fought toward Falaise, his resentment grew deeper. Eisenhower returned to the map. August 14th through August 19th, the Canadian battle for Falaise. The 1st Canadian Army faced a problem that seemed almost impossible to solve. They had to advance 20 miles through heavily defended territory, open farmland with few places to hide. Waiting for them were the best German divisions left in France, the SS divisions, the Hitler Youth, desperate men fighting for their lives. His voice dropped lower, more intense. Operation Tractable began at 4:30 in the morning on August 14th. Allied bombers dropped smoke bombs across the battlefield. Then 720 heavy bombers carpet-bombed German positions. More than 400 tanks started moving forward across the wheat fields. He paused. Then disaster struck. The smoke and dust confused the bomber crews. They could not see clearly. Some bombers dropped their loads on Canadian and Polish positions instead of German ones. Over 400 Allied soldiers became casualties from their own bombs. Men who had survived German artillery died because their own planes could not see them. The major's face went pale. And you know what those Canadians did? They attacked anyway, through their own dead. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division advanced 7 miles on the first day, but every mile cost blood. German soldiers were hiding in every farmhouse. The next 3 days brought house-to-house fighting in every village. Canadian artillery fired 250,000 shells. Each mile, the Canadians gained cost between 200 and 300 casualties. Eisenhower picked up a small, leather-bound book, a soldier's diary. Private John Thompson, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada, August 16th. The SS will not surrender no matter what, found dead Hitler Youth soldiers who looked 15 years old, still holding grenades in their dead hands. He closed the diary carefully. 15 years old, children fighting to the death. On August 16th, the town of Falaise finally fell to Canadian forces. But the battle was not over. The gap still remained open. 12 miles still separated the Canadians from Patton's American forces to the south. Through that opening, Germans were pouring like a river. Eisenhower's finger traced the shrinking gap on the map. The distance between the two Allied armies was shrinking. 12 miles to 10 miles to 5 miles, but it was shrinking too slowly. August 19th brought the critical moment. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, fighting under Canadian command, reached the village of Chambois from the north. The gap was now only 3 miles wide. He picked up another photograph, 2 soldiers shaking hands in a destroyed town square. At 7:20 in the evening on August 19th, a Polish captain named Jerzy Wasilowski shook hands with an American lieutenant in the town square of Chambois. A photographer captured the moment. The northern and southern pincers had linked. The Falaise pocket was officially closed. He set down the photograph. The Canadians and Poles had done it. They had closed the gap. and they had paid a terrible price, over 5,000 Canadian casualties, over 1,400 Polish casualties, young men who would never go home. Eisenhower picked up Patton's report again. Now George Patton is claiming their victory as his own. He barely mentions the Canadians. He says nothing about the Poles holding Hill 262 for 2 days while surrounded on 3 sides. He wants all the credit and all the glory. The Major's face showed controlled anger. "Sir, what are you going to do?" Eisenhower looked at the young officer for a long moment. "I could stay quiet and let Patton's version become the official story. That would keep the peace. But staying quiet means betraying the Canadians and Poles who actually won the battle. It means letting a lie become history." He walked around the desk, stood very close to the Major. "I am the Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe. I have a responsibility to tell the truth. I have a duty to honor the men who paid the price. So here is what I am going to do. I am going to confront George Patton directly about his false claims. I am going to ensure the official record tells the truth." He picked up the telephone. "Get me General Bradley, and start preparing travel orders. I want to visit the Falaise battlefield again tomorrow." The Major stood, saluted. "Sir, what you are doing, standing up for the truth, that is leadership." Eisenhower almost smiled. "No, Major, leadership is what those Canadian and Polish soldiers showed when they attacked through their own dead. I am just doing the minimum required of an honest man. Truth matters more than peace. Remember that. Truth matters more than glory, more than politics, more than keeping difficult men happy." The Major left quietly. Eisenhower stood alone as darkness fell. Before him lay Patton's report. Behind him hung the map showing where thousands had died. In his mind played images from yesterday. The corridor of death. The smell. The bodies. He began writing orders for tomorrow. The confrontation was coming. The reckoning. The moment when a leader must choose between comfortable lies and hard truths. And Dwight Eisenhower had already made his choice. August 23rd, 1944. Dawn. The jeep rattled along the narrow French road, throwing up dust that hung in the still morning air. Eisenhower sat in the back, silent, watching the countryside roll past. Wheat fields stretched toward the horizon, golden and peaceful in the early light. His driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The Supreme Commander had barely spoken since they left headquarters. Just sat there, jaw tight, eyes fixed on something the driver couldn't see. They were heading north, toward Falaise, toward the pocket that had closed 4 days ago, toward the truth. The smell hit them 5 miles out. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. The August heat had been cooking the dead for days, and the wind carried the sweet, sick odor across the fields like an invisible plague. Eisenhower pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, tied it around his face. It wouldn't help much, but men needed rituals, even useless ones, when confronting hell. "Sir," the corporal said quietly, "are you sure you want to, keep driving, son?" The road narrowed, trees closed in on both sides. Then suddenly the trees ended and they emerged into open ground. The corporal hit the brakes without being told. Before them stretched the corridor of death. Eisenhower had seen photographs, had read the reports. But understanding and seeing were different things. 3,000 vehicles destroyed in a 2-mile stretch. Tanks blown apart, their turrets lying 50 feet from their bodies like discarded toys. Trucks crushed and melted into abstract sculptures of twisted steel. Artillery pieces standing abandoned. Half tracks folded in on themselves, and everywhere the bodies. German soldiers in field grey. Horses, still in their traces. Thousands of animals killed, pulling supply wagons. The estimates ranged from 2,000 to 5,000. Nobody knew because there were too many to count. Eisenhower stepped out of the jeep. His boots crunched on debris, spent shell casings, broken glass, fragments of things that had been important to someone once. A burial detail worked 50 yards away. Young men with shovels and stretchers, cloths tied over their faces. One soldier was vomiting into a ditch. Nobody paid attention. They had all done it. A Canadian captain approached, saluted. His uniform was filthy. His eyes were older than his face. "General Eisenhower, sir. Captain Morrison, 1st Canadian Army. We weren't expecting I needed to see it again. Walk with me, Captain." They walked into the valley of steel and death. "We've collected over 8,000 German bodies so far," Captain Morrison said. His voice was flat, professional. "We estimate another 2,000 still out there." Eisenhower stopped beside a destroyed Tiger tank. Something had punched a hole clean through 3 inches of armor. The crew was still inside. "The Canadians did this," Eisenhower said. "Yes, sir. 18th Armored Regiment, 4th Canadian Armored Division. They held this ridgeline for 2 days, fired until their ammunition ran out, then called for more and kept firing." Eisenhower looked north toward the ridge, tried to imagine the scene. Canadian gunners working their weapons in the August heat, loading, firing, loading, firing. Below them, a river of German vehicles trying desperately to escape. They walked farther, past a burned-out half-track. "Casualties?" Eisenhower asked. "Light on the 20th, sir. Germans were mostly gone by then, either dead, captured, or escaped east." They climbed a small rise. At the top, Morrison pointed. "You can see Hill 262 from here, sir. The Poles held that position." Eisenhower raised his binoculars. 3 miles north, a hill rose above the surrounding farmland. From that height, you could see everything, every road, every escape route. "Tell me about the Poles." Morrison's voice gained an edge of respect. "Polish 1st Armored Division under General Maczek. They reached Chambois on the evening of August 19th, linked up with American 90th Infantry Division in the town square. That's when the pocket officially closed, but the Germans didn't stop fighting. On the morning of August 20th, thousands of German soldiers inside the pocket tried breaking through. At the same time, German forces outside attacked from the opposite direction, trying to rescue their comrades. And the Poles were in the middle. Yes, sir. Surrounded on 3 sides, outnumbered, low on ammunition, they held that hill for 2 full days. If they had broken, tens of thousands of Germans would have escaped. What were the Polish casualties? 35%, sir. 1 in 3 Polish soldiers killed or wounded in 48 hours. Silence. The wind moved through the wreckage. "And General Patton wants me to pretend this didn't happen," Eisenhower said. Morrison's face went carefully neutral. "Sir, I wouldn't know about, It's all right, Captain. I know what George is claiming, that's why I'm here. Your army closed this pocket. Canadian and Polish forces, you advanced 20 miles against the best German divisions in France. I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. You have my word." The captain's throat worked. "Sir, the men, they'll appreciate that. I know, I walked among them yesterday." They stood together on that small rise, looking out over a battlefield that would haunt both of them. This was what victory looked like when you stripped away the glory. This was the price of truth. Back at headquarters by noon, Eisenhower went straight to his office, closed the door, sat at his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He began organizing thoughts, building the case that would force George Patton to face reality. Canadian 1st Army casualties, August 8th through 23rd, 5,500. Polish 1st Armored Division casualties, August 19th through 21st, 1,400. United States 3rd Army casualties in the Argentine sector, 800. He stared at those numbers. The army that bled the most was the army that fought the hardest. Basic mathematics. George Patton wasn't stupid. He would see what these numbers meant. A knock at the door. "Come." His chief of staff entered. "Sir, General Bradley is on the telephone." "Put him through." Eisenhower picked up the receiver. "Brad." "Ike, what's this about?" Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior. Good soldier. Careful politician. "Have you read George's report from the 20th? A pause. "I have."
And I suggested he moderate the language. "Brad, it's not about language, it's about facts. George is claiming Third Army sealed the gap. That's not what happened. Ike, you know how George gets. I don't care how George gets. I just came from the battlefield. I walked among the dead. I spoke with Canadian officers who lost a third of their men. The Poles held Hill 262 for 2 days, surrounded on 3 sides, silence on the other end."
George reached Argenton on the 13th, exactly where we ordered him. He held that position perfectly, important work, but he did not close the gap. The Canadians closed the gap from the north. That is factual reality. Bradley sighed. "What do you want me to do?" "I'm calling George in tomorrow. I'm going to talk to him directly. I need you to back my play if this gets ugly." "Ike, Brad, this is not negotiable. I will not allow one man's ego to erase Canadian and Polish sacrifice. I will not betray our allies for the sake of keeping George happy." Another long pause. "All right, but be careful. George is fragile right now, more than he lets on. I'll push exactly as hard as necessary and not 1 inch further." "When are you seeing him?" "Tomorrow morning, 0900 hours. "Do you want me there?" "No, this needs to be between George and me, just 2 generals. If he refuses to modify his report, then I make it official. Press statement. Report to the combined chiefs, but I'm giving him the chance to do the right thing first." "That's generous. That's leadership, Brad. You give good men the chance to correct their mistakes before you embarrass them publicly." He hung up the phone. Alone again. Eisenhower sat in silence for a long moment. Then he did something he rarely did. He walked to the small cabinet in the corner of his office, pulled out a bottle of bourbon, poured 2 fingers into a glass. He didn't drink it immediately, just held it, looked at the amber liquid, catching the afternoon light. His mind ran calculations. Not military calculations, moral ones. Option 1, stay silent. Let Patton's version stand. Keep the peace. Keep America's best field commander happy. Keep the war machine running smoothly toward Berlin. Cost: betraying Canadian and Polish soldiers, letting a lie become history. Teaching future officers that glory matters more than truth. Option 2, confront Patton privately. Force him to modify the report. Risk losing him. Risk creating a political crisis. Cost: possible loss of Third Army's commander, possible damage to American morale, possible ammunition for critics who say Eisenhower favors British over Americans. Option 3, go public immediately, issue press statements, bypass Patton entirely, make the truth so loud nobody can ignore it. Cost: humiliating America's most famous general, creating a scandal, potentially undermining command authority. Eisenhower set down the glass, bourbon untouched. There was a 4th option, one his father had taught him back in Abilene. Do what's right, tell the truth, let the consequences take care of themselves. Simple, terrifying, necessary. He thought about those Canadian soldiers attacking through their own dead on August 14th. They hadn't calculated costs and benefits. They had simply done what had to be done. Polish gunners on Hill 262 hadn't run probability assessments. They had held their ground because letting go meant betraying everyone who depended on them. Sometimes leadership wasn't about making the smart choice. It was about making the right choice and accepting whatever came next. Eisenhower picked up his pen. began writing orders for tomorrow's confrontation. The decision was made. That night, Eisenhower couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, running through tomorrow's conversation. George would argue, that was certain. He would say his Third Army could have closed the gap if Montgomery hadn't stopped them. He would complain about politics. Some of that would be true. Patton's Third Army had performed brilliantly. Without Patton's aggressive tactics, there would have been no pocket to close. But recognition was not the same as claiming credit for work others did. He thought about General Maciek, 52 years old, Polish exile, his country invaded and carved up by Hitler and Stalin, no home to return to when the war ended. Maciek's men had held Hill 262, knowing they might die there, knowing their sacrifice might be forgotten, knowing that even if they survived, they had no country waiting, and they fought anyway. That was courage, real courage. Eisenhower would remember. He would make sure everyone remembered. He finally fell asleep sometime after midnight. August 24th, 08:30 hours. Eisenhower sat at his desk reviewing his notes one final time. The casualty figures, the timeline, the intelligence summaries, everything laid out in irrefutable logic. At 08:45, his secretary knocked. "Sir, General Patton is here." Eisenhower's stomach tightened. He took a slow breath. "Send him in 5 minutes." Alone again. Eisenhower stood, walked to the window. This was the moment, the confrontation he had been preparing for, the conversation that might cost him his best field commander, the choice between comfortable lies and hard truths. He thought about those Canadian soldiers, Polish gunners firing until their rifle barrels glowed red, Private John Thompson finding dead 15-year-olds still clutching grenades. Those men deserved the truth. They had paid for it. Eisenhower turned from the window, straightened his uniform. "All right, let's do what leaders must do." He pressed the intercom button. "Send General Patton in." The door opened. George Patton entered. 59 years old, shiny boots, ivory-handled pistols, a face that radiated confidence and barely suppressed aggression. "You wanted to see me, Ike?" Eisenhower did not smile, did not offer casual camaraderie. He simply looked at Patton for a long moment, then pointed to the chair. "Sit down, George. We need to talk about Falaise."
Patton's eyes narrowed slightly, but he sat, and the reckoning began. The door closed. Two generals alone in a small office. No stenographer, no witnesses, just the weight of history pressing down like August heat. Eisenhower let the silence stretch, a technique he had learned long ago. Let the other man speak first. But Patton was no amateur. He sat perfectly still, hands resting on his knees, those famous pistols gleaming at his sides, waiting. Finally, Eisenhower spoke.
"George, I've read your report dated August 20th. I've also visited the Falaise battlefield. Twice. I've spoken with Canadian, Polish, and British commanders. I've reviewed every casualty list, every intelligence summary." Patton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And?" Eisenhower opened a folder, pulled out casualty figures, slid them across the desk. "Look at these numbers, George. Canadian 1st Army, 5,500 casualties. Polish 1st Armored Division, 1,400 casualties in 2 days. United States 3rd Army in the Argentan sector, 800 casualties." He leaned forward. "Do you see what these numbers tell me? They tell me which army did the hardest fighting, which army paid the highest price, which army actually closed the Falaise Gap." "My army reached Argentan first," Patton said, heat beneath the controlled voice. "We could have closed that gap ourselves if Montgomery hadn't stopped us. Maybe, maybe not. Your supply lines were stretched thin. Your tanks were low on fuel. German forces were still strong enough to counterattack. The decision to stop at Argentan was sound military judgment. It was politics, Patton said flatly. You wanted to let the British take the glory. Eisenhower's eyes went cold. No, George, I wanted to prevent American and Canadian forces from shooting each other in the smoke and confusion. I wanted to preserve the coalition that is winning this war, and I wanted each army to complete the mission it was assigned. He stood, walked to the map. Your mission was to reach Argentan and hold the southern shoulder. You completed that mission perfectly. Third Army performed brilliantly. The breakout from Normandy, the drive east, the rapid encirclement. Without your aggressive tactics, there would have been no pocket to close. That deserves recognition. Eisenhower turned to face Patton directly. But reaching Argentan is not the same as closing the gap from the north. The Canadians did that. They advanced 20 miles against the Hitler Youth Division and the best SS troops in France. They fought through friendly fire that killed 400 of their own men, and they kept advancing anyway. They were slow, Patton said, too cautious. If you had let me, they were methodical because they were fighting the toughest German divisions while you sat at Argentan. The Germans knew that if the Allies closed the gap, they were finished. So they threw everything at the Canadians, every SS battalion, every Hitler Youth fanatic. He walked back to his desk, picked up another report. On August 19th at 1920 hours, a Polish captain named Jerzy Wasilowski shook hands with an American lieutenant in the town square of Chambois. That's when the northern and southern pincers linked. That's when the pocket officially closed. Your forces were 15 miles south at Argentan, where I ordered you to be. Patton's hands clenched into fists. So what are you saying, Ike? That Third Army doesn't deserve credit? I'm saying Third Army deserves credit for what it actually did, which was substantial, important, vital. But you did not close the Falaise Gap. The Canadians and Poles did, and your report needs to reflect that reality. The press won't see it that way. They'll say I failed, that the British beat me. The press can say whatever they want. My job is to ensure the official military record tells the truth. Patton stood abruptly, turned away, stared at the wall for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low, dangerous. You're asking me to give credit to the Canadians, to admit that Montgomery's forces beat mine. I'm asking you to honor the men who bled and died closing that pocket, regardless of their nationality. This is politics, Ike, pure politics. Eisenhower's voice went very quiet, very cold. I walked the corridor of death yesterday, George. I saw 3,000 destroyed vehicles. I smelled the dead horses rotting in August heat. I watched burial details collect bodies that had been cooking in the sun for 4 days. That battlefield tells me who did the fighting, not politics, just blood and death and mathematics. He picked up the casualty figures again. 35% casualties among the Poles in 48 hours. 1 in 3 Polish soldiers killed or wounded holding a single hill for 2 days. Surrounded on 3 sides, Germans attacking from inside the pocket trying to escape, Germans attacking from outside trying to rescue, and the Poles held anyway. Eisenhower's hands were shaking slightly. He set down the paper. Those men deserve history's gratitude, George. I will make certain they receive it, with or without your cooperation. Patton turned back. His face was flushed, angry. But beneath the anger, something that looked almost like shame. What do you want from me? I want your next report to reflect reality. I want you to acknowledge that Canadian First Army, including Polish and British forces, completed the Northern Encirclement. I want you to give credit where credit is due. And if I refuse? Eisenhower met his eyes, held them. Then I will issue a public press statement correcting the record. I will send a detailed report to the combined chiefs of staff. I will speak personally with Churchill and Roosevelt. I will ensure that every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every official history knows exactly what happened. You would embarrass me publicly. I would tell the truth publicly. There's a difference. Patton's jaw worked. He looked like a man trying to swallow something bitter. The American people need heroes, Ike. They need victories. Third Army gives them that. No, I'm asking you to be honest about what happened. Third Army has plenty of real achievements to celebrate. You don't need to steal someone else's victory. The word hung in the air. Steal. Patton's face went dark red. I have never stolen anything in my life. Then don't start now. They stared at each other. Two men who had worked together for years, who respected each other's abilities, who needed each other to win this war, but who stood on opposite sides of a gulf that no amount of military necessity could bridge. Eisenhower spoke more gently now. George, you are one of the finest field commanders I have ever seen. Your tactical brilliance is undeniable. The Third Army's achievements speak for themselves. You don't need to claim credit for Falaise to be remembered as a great general. Patton said nothing. But if you insist on maintaining this false narrative, you will force me to choose between you and the truth. And George, I will choose the truth, every time, without hesitation. Eisenhower walked around the desk, stood close to Patton, man to man. I'm giving you the chance to do the right thing. Modify your report, acknowledge Canadian and Polish contributions, preserve your honor and theirs, walk out of this office with your integrity intact, or refuse, and watch me do it for you. Your choice, George, but choose quickly. Patton looked at him for a long moment, then turned away, walked to the window, stared out at the French countryside. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Tired. Almost defeated. I could have closed that gap in one day, Ike. If you had let me push north from Argenton. Maybe you're right. We'll never know. Because that's not what happened. Montgomery stopped me because he wanted the glory for British forces. Montgomery stopped you because the boundary lines were set to prevent friendly fire, and because the Canadians were already advancing from the north. Patton turned back. Do you really believe the Canadians could have done it without us? Without Third Army holding the southern shoulder? Of course not. This was a coalition victory. Everyone played a vital role. Your role was crucial, but it was not the same as closing the gap from the north. That distinction matters.
To who? To the historians? To the men who died earning it? To the mothers who will never see their sons again? To the truth itself, George. It matters to the truth. Patton closed his eyes, took a deep breath. If I modify my report, the American press will crucify me. The American press will say whatever sells newspapers. But the official military record will show that you completed your assigned mission perfectly, that Third Army's performance was exemplary. Those are facts.
Undeniable facts. Just not the facts I wanted to claim. No, not those. Another long silence. Then Patton spoke so quietly Eisenhower almost didn't hear. I wanted this one, Ike. I needed it. After Sicily, after being sidelined, I needed a clear victory to restore my reputation. Eisenhower's voice softened. I know, George, I know what you've been through, but you can't restore your reputation by stealing someone else's victory. That's not who you are. You're better than that.
Patton laughed, a bitter sound. Am I? I'm not so sure anymore. He walked back to the desk, sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 59 years. All right, Ike, you win. I'll modify the report. I'll acknowledge the Canadians. Not what I'm asking, George. What's right? Yeah, sure, what's right? He stood to leave, then paused at the door. But for the record, Ike, I still believe Third Army could have done it faster, cleaner.
We were held back for political reasons, and history will eventually show that. Eisenhower watched him carefully. You're entitled to your opinion, George. Write it in your memoirs after the war. But the official record will reflect what actually happened, not what you wish had happened. Patton nodded once, sharp, bitter. Permission to return to my command, sir? Granted. The door opened, closed. Patton was gone. Eisenhower sat down at his desk. His hands were shaking, the adrenaline draining away, leaving exhaustion behind. He had won. Patton had agreed to modify his report. The truth would be preserved. But the victory felt hollow somehow. Necessary, but joyless. That evening, Eisenhower sat alone. On his desk lay Patton's diary entry from earlier that day. Somehow, it had found its way to him. August 24th, 1944, Ike read me the Riot Act, demanding I give credit to the Canadians. All damn politics. My Third Army could have closed that gap in one day. I'll modify the report if I must, but history will eventually show Third Army's true role. Eisenhower set down the diary page, felt a deep sadness settle over him. Even now, George still didn't understand, still saw this as politics instead of truth. Some men never learn. Some men can't see past their own need for glory. But that didn't change what Eisenhower had to do next. August 25th, morning. Eisenhower sat with his press officer, reviewing the statement. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force announces that 1st Canadian Army, including Polish and British forces, completed the northern encirclement of German forces in the Falaise Pocket on August 19th. This action, in coordination with United States Third Army holding the southern positions, resulted in the destruction of German 7th Army. Simple, precise, accurate. Release it. Next, he drafted his report to the combined chiefs of staff. The 1st Canadian Army's advance from Caen to Falaise and subsequently to Chambouin represents one of the outstanding tactical accomplishments of the Normandy campaign. General Crerar and General Simons demonstrated exceptional leadership. The casualties sustained by Canadian and Polish forces reflect the intensity of German resistance. Primary credit for completing the northern encirclement belongs to these forces. He signed it. Send it immediately. Finally, the phone calls. First to Winston Churchill. Prime Minister, I wanted you to know personally. The official record will show that Canadian forces played the decisive role in closing the Falaise Gap. Churchill's voice came through warm with pleasure. Thank you, General Eisenhower. Canada will remember this. You have given the Canadians something precious. Recognition, respect, truth. It's what they earned, sir. Perhaps, but what men earn and what they receive are not always the same. You have made them the same today. That is leadership. Next, a message to Roosevelt. Mr. President, the official record will reflect Canadian and Polish primary role. This may create controversy with the American press, but it is historically accurate and strategically necessary for Allied unity. Roosevelt's reply came back within hours. Approved, tell the truth, and let the chips fall. That's what we pay you for, Ike. Eisenhower smiled, first time in days. The consequences rippled outward. Paris was liberated on August 25th, just 4 days after the Falaise Pocket closed. The German forces that might have defended the capital were dead or captured in the Norman countryside. The road east lay open. The Allied advance accelerated across France. German troops retreated toward the Siegfried Line. The war in France was essentially won. All of this became possible because the Canadians and Poles had closed the gap. For coalition management, Eisenhower's handling proved crucial. Word spread through Canadian units. The Supreme Commander had stood up for them, had confronted America's most famous general. Trust deepened. Resentments dissolved. The Canadians saw they had a voice at the highest levels. That truth was more important than politics. A precedent was set. Accurate credit mattered. Fairness mattered. The coalition would survive only if every nation felt its contributions were honestly recognized. Years later, the men who shaped Falaise would walk very different paths. General Guy Simonds survived and rose to become Chief of the General Staff of the Canadian Army from 1951 to 1955. But Simonds never sought publicity for Falaise. His private papers showed he was satisfied that Eisenhower had ensured the accurate record. When reporters asked about Patton's claims in the 1960s, Simonds responded with careful diplomacy. General Patton was a great commander, but Falaise was a Canadian battle. He lived until 1974, dying at age 71 with his reputation intact. General Harry Crérar's health broke under the stress of command. After the war ended, he retired in 1946. Crérar spent his retirement ensuring Canadian war history accurately documented his army's achievements. He exchanged letters with Eisenhower, thanking the Supreme Commander for standing up for truth. Those letters still exist in archives. He died in 1965, satisfied that the record would show what his men had accomplished. General Stanislaw Maczek's story was the saddest of all. He commanded Polish forces brilliantly through to the end of the war, but after the war, Communist Poland revoked his citizenship. The new government in Warsaw, controlled by Stalin, declared Maczek a traitor for fighting with the Western Allies. He could not return home. He was a general without a country. Maczek lived in exile in Scotland. Unable to find work that matched his abilities, he worked as a bartender in Edinburgh. A general who had commanded thousands, who had held Hill 262 against impossible odds, now serving drinks to strangers who did not know his name. The Polish government ignored his contributions for 45 years. Only after communism fell in 1989 did Poland finally recognize him as a hero. Maczek lived to age 102, dying in 1994. He finally received the honors he deserved, but it came 50 years too late. Lieutenant General George S. Patton continued as Third Army commander. He spearheaded the drive across France and into Germany. His aggressive tactics made him even more famous. But Patton never saw peacetime. In December 1945, just months after Germany surrendered, he was seriously injured in a car accident in occupied Germany. He died from those injuries on December 21, 1945. His memoir was published after his death. Interestingly, the published version gave more credit to the Canadians than his original reports. Perhaps Patton had accepted Eisenhower's correction. Perhaps his editors made the changes. He was a brilliant commander and a difficult personality, hungry for credit, but capable of greatness. General Dwight D. Eisenhower went on to even greater achievements. He remained Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, directing the war to final victory on May 8, 1945. After the war, he became President of the United States, serving from 1953 to 1961. In 1948, while still a general, he published his memoir, Crusade in Europe. In that book, he described Falaise in detail and specifically credited Canadians and Poles for closing the northern pincer. Throughout his life, Eisenhower maintained correspondence with Canadian veterans groups. His intervention at Falaise became a model for how he managed coalition warfare. He always insisted on factual accuracy over national glory. August 2024, 80 years later. Hill 262, Normandy, France. A handful of veterans in their late 90s and 100s attended the commemoration at the memorial. Canadian, Polish, and even one German veteran stood together. They were old men now, leaning on walking sticks, sitting in wheelchairs. The battles they fought belonged to history, but the men who fought them were still real. A Polish veteran, aged 98, spoke to the crowd. "We fought here together, Canadian and Polish soldiers side by side. We held the hill. We closed the gap. That is the truth. That is what happened. And now, after all these years, finally everyone knows it. The Canadian beside him, age 100, added his own words. General Eisenhower made sure of that. He stood up for us when it mattered. That is leadership. They saluted the memorial together. The flags of Poland, Canada, America, and France snapped in the Norman wind, the same wind that had blown across these fields in August 1944 when the world was on fire. In the evening light, as the ceremony ended and crowds dispersed, a tour guide led a group of American visitors up the hill, teenagers mostly, bored, checking their phones. "This is where Polish soldiers held off the Germans for 2 days," the guide said. "Surrounded, outnumbered, they held anyway." One teenager looked up. "Why?" The guide paused. "How do you explain courage to someone who's never had to find it?" "Because someone had to, and they were the ones standing there when the moment came." The teenagers took selfies by the memorial, moved on to the next site, but one stayed behind, a young man, maybe 19. He read the names carved into stone, hundreds of them, looked out over the valley where 3,000 vehicles once burned. He thought about his own life, his own choices, what he would do if the moment came, if someone depended on him, if truth mattered more than comfort. He didn't know yet. Nobody knows at 19. But maybe someday he'll remember this hill, these names, the story of a general who chose truth over glory. And maybe that will matter when his own moment comes. The sun touched the horizon. Shadows lengthened across the memorial. The young man turned to leave, but first he did something unexpected. He saluted. Awkward, unpracticed, but genuine. Then he walked down the hill into the gathering dusk. Behind him, carved in stone, the truth remains. The story of what Eisenhower said when Patton claimed credit is not just about one general correcting another. It is about ensuring that those who paid the price received the honor they earned. It is about truth prevailing over ego. It is about coalition warfare at its best, when the mission and the men matter more than personal glory. That lesson echoes across the decades, as important now as it was in August 1944, when the gap finally closed and the truth began its long fight to be remembered. And in the end, truth won. Because Dwight Eisenhower chose it and stood by that choice when it mattered most.